Now we begin our journey through the world of the earliest civilizations. And our journey begins in Mesopotamia, with the earliest Mesopotamian civilization which flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. The first thing we're going to do is explore the farming societies which used irrigation to grow crops along the rivers and in the southern Mesopotamian delta. Then we'll describe the Ubaid farming culture and the first towns and cities to develop in the south. We'll show how the temple was the focus of emerging Sumerian society, while long-distance trade mushroomed in the 4th millennium BC. Next, we'll describe some of the innovations which contributed to the rapid development of Sumerian cities. Then we'll analyze the salient features of Sumerian civilization with its small, competing city-states. We'll end the lecture with a brief survey of Akkadian and then Sumerian efforts to forge much larger empires, a trend that defined the long-term characteristics of Mesopotamian civilization. Mesopotamia is Greek for the land between the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was the area thought by the devout Victorians to be the biblical Garden of Eden. Today, it is far from a paradisial place, a land of sand, swamp, and dry mud flats, with long hot summers and harsh winters. But in ancient times, with irrigation, the fertile alluvial soils of the Euphrates and Tigris delta yielded bountiful crops for thousands of years, until the rising salinity of the soil caused crop yields to plummet. Farming was established by at least 8000 BC in northern Iraq, in the higher ground, probably even earlier, we don't know. But by 2000 years later, around 6000 BC, village farmers practiced simple irrigation in this region by diverting spring floodwaters across their fields, then draining it away to prevent salt buildup. There was a tradition of agriculture using irrigation which went back a long way. They had no option in this land, which had these long, very hot summers which were intensely dry. The earliest known farming communities in the southern delta, in classic Mesopotamia, date to before 5800 BC. These were communities that lived on the fertile alluvium caused by the drowning of the Tigris and Euphrates estuary by the rising Persian Gulf after the Ice Age. You'll recall in earlier lectures we talked about the dramatic changes in the world landscape and coastlines resulting from the Ice Age, and that only 15,000 years ago the world's sea levels were 300 feet lower than they are today. The effects of this in some parts of the world, like for example Southeast Asia or Northern Europe, were dramatic. And this was another area where it was very dramatic. During the late Ice Age, the Persian Gulf was a narrow gorge and a fast-moving estuary for the rivers. But as sea levels rose rapidly, the Persian Gulf was flooded, and water flooded onto the southern Mesopotamian plain. As a result of the silt deposited by these floods, all traces of earlier inhabitants are buried under many feet of river silt resulting from the annual floods. But we do know that there were people living in this region at least as early as 6000 BC and probably very much earlier. I would not be surprised if this region was not in fact an area of very early agriculture indeed. Now, the many farming villages which must have flourished in this area because the soils were exceptionally fertile coalesced into clusters of smaller hamlets surrounding larger towns with perhaps as many as 3,000 inhabitants. Why did they do this? Because the climate was getting warmer and drier, and it was necessary for them to collaborate in irrigation. Now, these people are called the Ubaid people, after a settlement, an archaeological site given that name. They grew barley and dates, and they herded cattle, sheep, and goats. In other words, it was a classic mixed farming sort of economy. Their agriculture was not dry agriculture, depending on rainfall. It depended not only on rainfall, but simple irrigation, using canals built by communal effort and careful organization, organized by local leaders. Why? They were diverting the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates onto their farms, and to build any size of waterworks requires crowds of people, not just one household. Agriculture had moved beyond the compass of a single household. Within a few centuries, some Ubaid settlements reached considerable size, with mud houses clustered around small ceremonial centers. What you see happening here is a process of centralization, inexorable, probably in large part resulting from two things. One, the reality that agriculture required the deployment of sizable labor forces, not only to plant and grow the crops and to divert water, but to maintain the waterworks so there was water enough to produce several harvests a year. Secondly, as more and more land was brought under cultivation, there may have been a shortage of land where cities or towns could be built, maybe areas of higher ground, and people tended to live in more compact settlements and to live in the same place for many generations. The result of all this was the development of the world's very first cities. The history of these cities is deeply embedded in ancient Sumerian myth. By 4700 BC, that is about 1100 years before the appearance of Sumerian civilization, the rapidly growing town of Eridu boasted of a mud brick temple. This was a city which was said to be the home of Enlil, the principal Sumerian god. No question that the origins of this deity go back into ancient village religious belief. Within only 2 centuries, the temple had achieved a much greater elaboration, and as many as 5,000 people were living close by. This temple has been dissected by extremely intricate excavation. The trouble is with this sort of architecture is that it is in mud brick. And mud brick, when it's abandoned, rapidly becomes almost indistinguishable from the surrounding soil. And one of the ways you can tell it apart from undisturbed soil is by using compressed air, blow away dust, or by simply probing. And the dissection of the Eridu temple through all its many iterations was an extremely complex piece of excavation carried out before World War II. Between 4600 and 3800 BC, another town nearby, Uruk, grew rapidly in size. A temple mound, called in the archaeological parlance of the area a ziggurat, towered over the growing community. It stood on the foundations of earlier, much more humble shrines. Here, as you find in Maya country, or you find with the Aztecs, people tended to build sacred places one on top of the other, so that you get a wonderful stratigraphy, as it were, a layering of different temples from the earliest humble shrine to the great and elaborate temples of later times. As early as 3500 BC, Uruk was a substantial settlement. At this point, you could safely call it a city. We know it was ruled by a secular and religious ruler known as the En. He presided over the temple and over an emerging small kingdom whose prosperity was based not so much on political power, although its religious authority must have been considerable, but on its control of very far-flung trading connections, which extended far to the west, toward the Mediterranean coast, across the Syrian desert, and north into the Iranian highlands. What were they obtaining? They lived in a timberless environment without metal. They were trading for raw materials, like copper ore. In exchange, they would trade and exchange foodstuffs, clay pots, and other materials. As a result of all this, and the great intensification of agriculture, Uruk soon became a city with a lattice, and I think a lattice is rather a good word for this, of satellite villages extending out from the city at least 6 miles. Why a lattice? Because each of these villages had its own irrigation system. But the city and each of the villages depended on one another for food and for other commodities, and the villages on the city for protection against outsiders, which, as we will see, was very important. It was a lattice of interaction. Uruk and other growing cities developed their own governments, each with a well-defined hierarchy of rulers and priests, of landowners and bureaucrats, traders and farmers. It was a system common to each of these cities, whatever the local variations. The system handed out rewards to worthy officials, inflicted punishment on rebels and on criminals, organized and regulated society through religious belief, through education, and made policy decisions for its citizens. The countryside became the hinterland of the city, and later the city-state, so characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization. I stress the word city-state. A city-state has a small territory, very much smaller than, say, maybe 30, 40 miles across, as opposed to the linear, long state that was ancient Egypt, which extended from the Mediterranean up to the first cataract at what is now Aswan. So very early on, this characteristic sort of jigsaw puzzle of city-states was developing with all these towns down in southern Mesopotamia as life became more and more centralized, where these lattices of interaction developed. And this is no coincidence, by about 3400 BC also, the first signs of writing appeared. How did writing develop? It is thought, although some people disagree, that the first Mesopotamian writing, the characteristic wedge-shaped cuneiform named after the Greek word cuneus, which means a web, developed from an infinitely earlier system of small clay tokens. Imagine, if you will, a world where communication is not easy and you were trading, say, copper for grain over several hundred miles using caravans of donkeys to do so. You do not know the people that you are trading with at the other end. So with the leader of the caravan, maybe you send a little clay envelope, as it were, full of a finite number of clay tokens, which count inventory, as it were, what the commodity is, and they send one back to you. Now, tokens like this go way back into early farming villages, but the system clearly got more elaborate as time went on. And eventually, as Denise Schman-Basserat says, who is an expert on this, the simple pictographic signs, picture signs, and later wedge-shaped cuneiform symbols substituted for the tokens. So writing developed from a simple inventory system. And the earliest cuneiform was probably used purely for record purposes, to record inventories and commercial transactions and the contents of temple storerooms. Because the point being that if you are going to control a trade, you've got to know what you're trading, what the contents of your storerooms are, and how you can allocate them in times of need, or for reward, or for tribute, or whatever. So inventorying really was probably where writing first began. As I said in the previous lecture, a very different thing from the literacy of our own civilization. It was 1,000 years or so before Sumerian writing became much more and created the world's first literature. There's a wonderful book about Sumerian civilizations by a man called Samuel Kramer. It's called The Sumerians. It was written a good quarter century ago. But it's a marvelous, well-written essay which draws not only on archaeology, but on literature. And in there you can read prayers and laments, and the exercises done by schoolboys, even parts of an agricultural manual, which show you the enormous flexibility and potential of Sumerian writing, which unleashed a whole area of human creativity which had not flourished before. But again, this literacy was confined to a relatively small number of people, the scribes, people of power, who went through demanding training to learn this from a very early age. And it was they that controlled information. And in a real sense, unless the king himself was literate, they also controlled the ruler, because literacy was power. Another thing developed at about this time, at about 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, and that was the first copper metallurgy. Copper is a lovely metal. It's shiny. It's ideal for ornaments. It glitters in the sun. And it's no coincidence that at first copper was a highly valued prestige material for shiny ornaments. It was easy to melt. People who could make pottery could soon learn how to melt copper. And more than 1,000 years was to pass before metalsmiths learned how to alloy copper with lead or tin and to make bronze. What's the advantage of bronze? A much tougher working edge so that you can use metal objects for cutting down trees, for growing crops, and above all, as weapons. Bronze was a strategic weapon, metal. Copper was purely an ornamental one. Another point about lead and tin was that they were rare to find. The sources were limited, and trade in metals intensified once bronze technology came into use. So you've got cities, writing, metallurgy, intensified trade, irrigation, agriculture, and lattices of interaction and small city-states. And it was out from this matrix of developing city-states that Sumerian civilization developed in Mesopotamia, one of the world's earliest civilizations after 3100 BC. It did not suddenly appear Zeus-like from nowhere. It was the culmination of centuries of rapid economic, social, and political elaboration. It emerged at a time when even moderate-sized towns maintained trading and other connections with people living considerable distances away. Let's take the example of Uruk. Uruk, one of the world's earliest cities, acquired obsidian, that's volcanic glass, metals, wood, seashells, and other exotic materials from as far away as the eastern Mediterranean. Now, this wasn't a trade where caravans marched in large numbers. A great deal of this trade was by exchange from one community to another. But something is beginning to happen here at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. Because the trade isn't just between one city-state and another, over, say, a distance of 100 miles. You're now seeing much, much longer distance connections developing. Connections which linked Southwest Asia and Mesopotamia with eastern Iran, even with the Indus Valley in Pakistan. So the Indus Valley was linked to Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, those areas eventually to the Nile and the Mediterranean coast. You were developing a much, much larger lattice of interaction, or as some people call it, the world's first world economic system, or first global economy. This is a bit overdrawn, but for the first time you're finding human societies trading on a very much larger scale, where they're really dealing with civilizations like themselves, with individual rulers or whatever, at much longer distances. There is no question, too, that this much larger connection is connected also with the improvement of long-distance transportation. Sailing boats developed on the Nile and in Mesopotamia. Wheeled carts came in very rapidly. Draft oxen, donkeys used for caravans. In other words, people were moving off the tyranny of the limited load carried on people's shoulders, which was always a problem, say, for the Maya and the Aztecs, who did not have draft animals. And from this developed not just Sumerian civilization, but a much larger Eastern Mediterranean world. Sumerian civilization itself was born of the growing interdependence of city-states in Mesopotamia. Each of them was small. They competed, they fought, they traded with each other in a very, very volatile political and diplomatic environment, where there was constant negotiation, an intricate pattern of ever-changing alliances that came into being and evaporated and came back generation to generation, city to city, ruler to ruler. The point you must understand, however, which I emphasize again and again, is that Mesopotamia was not unique, for cities were also developing in other parts of Southwest Asia, as far afield as the Indus Valley in Pakistan and on the Iranian plateau. This volume of long-distance trade which resulted in much larger political ambitions. The trade increased, much of it carried by donkey caravans and by ships. And inevitably, as society became more complex, so city rulers became more secular, and the priesthood a specialized occupation. They may still be divine kings, but their primary concerns were secular, particularly in the world of Sumeria, where civilization was a world of constant bickering and shifting alliances. Some city-states, like famous for the excavations by the British archaeologists Leonard Woolley before World War II, had periods of great political strength and prosperity when they dominated their neighbors. And then, just as swiftly, perhaps the result of a reign by a couple of less competent rulers and ambitious neighbors, they would tumble into obscurity and become vassals of a neighbor. There was no permanent political unity, no vast state like you find in Egypt. It was constant warfare waged by the world's first standing armies. This was not informal warfare. This was institutionalized warfare, because standing armies were one of the keys to maintaining political power. This was a patchwork, quarrelsome, volatile, but with enormous potential. Some Sumerian cities nurtured powerful rulers, like the wealthy individuals buried in the famous royal burials at the ancient city of excavated by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, as I told you, in the 1930s. He reconstructed a funeral where the mourners had dug a deep funerary pit, buried the body of a prince in a stone burial chamber at the foot of it, surrounded by his faithful retainers who were sacrificed to accompany him in death in all his glorious golden regalia. And then 59 people filed into the burial pit down a ramp, including wagons drawn by oxen, all of them wearing the regalia of their various offices in the court: courtiers, soldiers, serving women, and so on. And each of them carried a small clay cup. Trumpets blew, a signal was given, and all the court, the 59 people, drank this cup, which apparently contained some poison, and laid down in order and died. The pit was then filled in with more sacrifices, and the funeral was over. The expectation was that the ruler would carry on in the same style in the next world. This funeral was reconstructed brilliantly by Leonard Woolley. Unfortunately, his excavation notes are too inadequate, and the site itself, the burial, was destroyed during excavation, that we do not know, in fact, whether this is an accurate reconstruction. But knowing Woolley's work, it's probably quite likely. Over time, it's inevitable that the ambitions of some of these city-state rulers extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Inevitably, too, they sought to control the lucrative trade routes which crossed the Syrian desert to the eastern Mediterranean coast. By 2500 BC, after 600 years of civilization, Akkadian cities to the north of Sumerian country, around modern-day Baghdad, were competing with their southern neighbors for power and wealth. In 2334 BC, King Sargon of Agadi, south of Babylon, extended his domains by trade and military campaigns to include not only Sumer, but northern Mesopotamia. He was a very able monarch, and his successors were not. Political chaos followed a severe drought in the north. The Akkadian kingdom collapsed abruptly, and King Ur-Nammu of Ur took control of Sumer and Akkad in 2112 BC. Unlike Sargon, Ur-Nammu and his successors of the third Ur royal dynasty were expert administrators and diplomats. Their great empire flourished for 120 years, during which time they established some very important things: a persistent tradition of Mesopotamian civilization which combined trade, conquest, ruthless administration, despotism, with tribute to forge large, poorly integrated and highly volatile empires that spanned the world between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. And then, in 1990 BC, Sumerian civilization gave way to Babylonian civilization, and then to the great imperial empire of the Assyrians. But by that time, Mesopotamia was a much larger world. It was part of a much larger universe, the universe of the Egyptians, the universe of the eastern Mediterranean coast, and of the Hittites, which we'll talk about later. We have moved on from a small-scale civilization, from the beginnings of Mesopotamian civilization, which we described in this lecture, starting with the village societies which flourished on the southern delta after 5700 BC. We described the growth of towns into cities, communities like Erech and Uruk by 3800 BC, also innovations like writing and metallurgy which followed. We've explored the beginnings of Sumerian civilization with its patchwork of competing city-states and extensive interconnections which laid the foundations for the volatile Mesopotamian civilizations of later times and for a much more interconnected world. Part of this new commercial and political world was Egypt, which we describe in the next two lectures as the counterpoint to Mesopotamia.